Hello again, everyone. So we have now entered into interpretation and the interpretation step of Bible study. Last week, we did a mass review on the observation step. And now, if we were doing an actual Bible study, we would have amassed all of our information from observation. And now we have the task of figuring out, what does it mean? And more importantly, asking ourselves, why can't I just assume I know what it means? Because in interpretation, it is often very dangerous to just assume you know what the text means, because there are barriers that can mess up our interpretation. And there are four that we are going to look at. They are language, culture, genre, and communication. And in a video coming after this, we will look at how to overcome them. But for now, we are just focusing on what are these barriers and how do they affect us. And so our first barrier is language. This is probably not a new fact to you guys, but the Bible is written in three languages originally. The Old Testament is largely written in Hebrew. The New Testament is largely written in Greek, and sprinkled in both the Old Testament and the New Testament is a third language called Aramaic. There we go. Now, I would venture to guess that as an American Christian, you probably don't understand any of those three languages the Bible is written in. In fact, even if you were an Israelite, if you were a Jew, a Hebrew, born in Israel, if you were an Israeli, born in Israel, who spoke Hebrew, or a Greek, born in Greece, who spoke Greek, you would notice a massive difference between the language that you read and write and understand and speak and the language used in the Bible. And that's because over time, languages change. The words that they use can change meaning over time. The figures of speech they use can fall to the wayside, can fall out of practice, and new ones can come into practice. Common phrases can get switched around, can get altered. If you really want to think about it, we, English speakers in America, do not speak and sound the same as, say, a 16th century English speaker in England. And that's because there's been a lot of change. And now we exaggerate that, not just 500 years, but 2,000 or 4,000 years. There's a big language difference. And in our English translations, though they do their absolute best, the ones that do word-for-word translations, to get the exact meaning of the Hebrew or of the Greek, it is a translation. And they are limited by the English language. And so sometimes it's very hard for them to get the proper wording on a Hebrew or Greek word. And so without understanding the original language and being able to read the Bible in its original language, our first barrier is simply language. A 21st century English speaker does not understand the rules that ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew were built on. The next barrier is culture. And culture, the definition, is the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a nation, people, or group. So this is their government. This is their religious system. This is their trade systems. This is how they act within a family. This is how they act within a tribe or within a clan. This is how they express themselves through art, whether that's painting, whether that's sculpting, whether that's architecture and how they build their buildings. And this is their achievements, whether they were on the cutting edge of technology for their time and used a certain metal or a certain technology that put them ahead of everybody else. All of that is involved in culture. And just like language, culture changes over time. And the Bible contains a lot of time. If we start with Adam and Eve, and we run all the way to Malachi, which is just the Old Testament, we are looking at least 4,000 years. Culture can change dramatically in those 4,000 years. If we look at Abraham to Joseph, we see wealthy individuals who came to own a lot of cattle and a lot of servants, and who were seen more or less as princes within the land, interacting with city-states and the rulers of city-states. We fast forward 500 years, and we get to Moses in the wilderness wanderings. And now this people group that had grown up in Egypt and had only really known Egyptian culture, maybe slightly different because they were Jewish, and so they had a mixture of Hebrew culture and Egyptian culture, are now expelled from that country and are wandering around in the wilderness. They don't have a country yet. In fact, most of the wilderness wandering, they are getting the rules. They are learning how their legal system is going to be set up. They are learning how their religious system is going to be set up when they do finally have a country, and for while they are wandering. On top of that, they are surrounded by other countries and other people groups that have been established for a while, who have their own cultures that are seeping in to the Hebrews. And then we fast forward another 500 years, and we have King David and King Solomon, and those people who were wandering in the wilderness, who are getting their nation set up, are now in their golden age. This is the biggest Israel will ever get. This is the most powerful Israel will ever be, is under King David and under King Solomon. And those government systems, those religious systems that were being figured out, are now established. They have a strong and powerful standing army. They have an established form of religious life, of government life, of normal life. They have established trade with allies, with enemies. And then we fast forward 100 or another 500 years, and all of that is gone. Israel has been destroyed by Assyria, and all the Israelites of the northern 10 tribes are scattered throughout the world, and the people who now live where they once lived are not Jewish. We have the southern kingdom of Judah taken over by the Babylonians, brought into exile, where a generation or two only knows Babylonian culture, again, maybe mixed with Jewish culture. And they are now returning, and they have to figure out how to rebuild everything. How to rebuild the temple and the government and the religious system. And then we fast forward another 500 years, and Rome rules. And we are dealing with an Israel that is dealing with an oppressive Roman government. And this is where Jesus comes into play. And so as you can see, there are a lot of cultural differences just within one people group over long periods of time. And we can't use our 21st century Western culture with its values on individualism, freedom, liberty, human rights, as a starting point to understand first century Jewish literature, which is what the New Testament is, or 10th or 15th century BC Jewish culture, which is what the Old Testament contains. And so we have to piece the culture of the time, whatever time period we're in, back together to understand the text properly. And so this is our second barrier. It's the fact that it's a different culture, and it's a culture we don't understand because we grew up in an American culture and a 21st century American culture, not a 2nd century Jewish culture. The next barrier is genre. Now, the Bible contains 6 genres. Some might say 7. For simplicity's sake, we'll say 6. Among the 66 books. The 6 genres are exposition, narrative, parables, poetry, wisdom literature, and prophecy apocalyptic. Exposition is a straightforward argument of the truth. You are just laying out facts, left and right, and building your argument based off of them. It is very logical, it is very straightforward, and a great example of this is the book of Romans. Narrative is what many people would refer to as the stories of the Bible. It is the biographies, the historical accounts, this person did this thing, interacted with this person, did this thing, so on and so forth. Again, very literal. They are just describing what the people do, how the people act, what the people say. And we see this from Genesis to Ezra, and we see this from Matthew to Acts, is just narrative. It's biography. It's telling about people's life. Parables are stories with a moral principle. And in parables, the story being told doesn't matter as much as the principle being explained. But parables are stories. They use a common imagery that a lot of people would understand for the time to explain their moral teaching, their moral principle they're trying to get across. And we see a lot of these in the Gospels. Poetry is emotional. Poetry is imaginative. And in Jewish culture, it would probably be sung. And great examples of poetry exist between Job and the Song of Psalms. Or the Song of Songs. Sorry. Also the Psalms. Where we have this imaginative, image-filled language describing certain things through poetry. Then we have wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is an experienced person teaching an inexperienced person. The quintessential example of wisdom literature is Proverbs. Proverbs is Solomon talking to his son and using general things that he has learned and he has observed in his own life and teaching it to his son. Ecclesiastes is a much older Solomon looking back on his own life and going, this is what I have learned from having lived my life the way I have lived it. And this is the wisdom I am now passing on to you, next generation. And so while it might not be as emotional and as imaginative, as flowery as poetry, it still is using a lot of general observations to come to certain conclusions about life and how life works. And finally, we have prophecy and apocalyptic. And some people would separate these two. That's neither here nor there. Prophecy and apocalyptic both do the same thing. They give God's message through warning and judgment. They tell of what is to come as God's message. For prophecy, the major prophets and the minor prophets, Isaiah to Malachi, great examples. For apocalyptic, the book of Revelation is the book. It is where the word apocalyptic comes from. And in these, there's a lot of figurative language. There is a lot of imagery being used that can be really hard to work out and figure out what exactly it means. And unfortunately, these genres are not nicely split throughout the Bible. It's not like each genre gets its own 11 books and it's all neat and orderly and none of them mix. There aren't examples of some and others, because that's not the case. Every book in the Bible is going to have one major genre, one major category that it falls into. However, it can still have other genres mixed in. So, for example, when we look at the Gospels, they are narrative. That is their general category. It is a biography on what Jesus is doing. However, within the narrative, Jesus is using parables to teach. And Jesus is prophesying about certain things, which are two other genres. And so it's not a clean-cut separation. They are mixed. But generally, a book will have one major genre and then little mixtures of other genres put in. And so we must know what genre we are dealing with to properly understand the book, to properly understand the passage. Because we interpret exposition different than we interpret prophecy. And we interpret biography different than we interpret poetry. And our final barrier is communication. And largely this is a barrier that is caused by us, not so much by time. Sometimes we just are not picking up what the Bible is putting down. We have read the passage, we've reread the passage, we've read it in a different version, maybe we've read it even in a different language, if you're capable of doing that. We've done our word studies. We've gotten the context. We know who's involved. We know who they're speaking to. We know who they're speaking about. We're just not getting it. It's just not sitting right. It's not making sense. And much like the reading strategy, sometimes we just have to be patient. Because sometimes this barrier doesn't just go away because we do all the right things. Sometimes a passage is just not going to sit well with you. And it's going to be hard for you to understand. And so this can be another barrier that shows up in interpretation, is the fact that we just don't understand it. We don't want to be patient. We want to just be done. And so we might throw the wrong interpretation in there and call it a day. And so those are the 4 barriers to interpretation: language, culture, genre, and communication. And a proper understanding of these 4 can greatly impact how we understand the text, and an improper understanding of these 4 can greatly impact how we massacre the text. But these are our 4 barriers, and really the first 3 are due to time, and the last one is just due to us. Or maybe the passage that we're dealing with is exceptionally hard. But when you think about it, it's not always going to be super easy to know what the text is saying. You are reading, when you open your Bible, you are reading a passage that is at least 2,000 years old. That is what you're doing. You have opened a book that is at least 2,000 years old, if not older. It was written in a country you've probably never visited. It was written in a culture you don't understand, and that no longer truly exists. And it was written in a language that you don't know. If you found a random letter from 2,000 years ago, written in a language you don't know, from a culture you don't understand, from a country you don't know where it is, it's going to be really hard to know what the letter means. And that's the same with the Bible. These are just barriers that can get in our way if we try to rush through interpretation. They will trip us up. They will damage our interpretation if we aren't cautious and if we don't take the time to properly understand what does it mean.